I married while pregnant to the man I thought was the love of my life. But on the day I gave birth, while I was fighting to bring our son into the world, he ran away with the doctor who was supposed to care for me. The most painful betrayal wasn't his escape, but discovering their affair had started during my prenatal appointments. Hello, my name is Andrea. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to share with you the story that shaped who I am. A story of pain and betrayal, but also one of tremendous resilience. Before I begin, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to The Grandma's Diary. It really helps spread these real-life stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my words reach people from so many different places. It all began when I was 20 years old. I was a simple small-town girl, raised with family values and romantic dreams. I worked as a clerk in the only bakery in town, a place so small that everyone knew each other. That's where I met Daniel. He walked into the bakery one Saturday afternoon. Tall, dark-haired, with blue eyes that seemed to pierce your soul. The son of respected local business owners, Daniel had everything: education, money, charm. When he smiled at me, I felt my legs tremble. I had never felt anything like this for anyone before. "What's your name?" he asked. I could barely answer, I was so nervous. After that, he started showing up every day, always during my break, always with a small flower he'd picked along the way. Our courtship was fast and intense. My parents thought it was all too rushed, especially since his family was from a different social class than ours. Rich folks don't mix with simple folk, my mother would say. But when your heart is involved, advice goes in one ear and out the other. 3 months after we met, I discovered I was expecting a child. I remember shaking so much while taking the test that I nearly dropped everything. Back then, an unmarried pregnant girl was cause for scandal, closed doors, and disapproving looks. I cried all night before finding the courage to tell him. When I finally did, I was surprised. Daniel smiled, held my hands, and said, "I've always wanted to start a family. I just didn't know it would be so soon." The following Saturday, he showed up at my house with his parents, officially asked for my hand, and we set the wedding for a month later before my baby bump would start showing. The ceremony was simple, but I was radiant in my modest white dress that concealed the early signs of pregnancy. I thought I had found my Prince Charming, that my life would be like the fairy tales I read as a child. The first months of marriage were peaceful. We moved into a small but comfortable house that his parents helped buy. Daniel worked in the family store and seemed excited about the baby's arrival. He bought a crib even before we knew if it would be a boy or a girl, and painted the nursery a soft yellow. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. When it came time to start prenatal care, a family friend recommended Dr. Olivia, an obstetrician who had recently moved to our town. "She trained in New York. She's modern and up-to-date," they said. I made the first appointment with a heart full of expectations. Dr. Olivia was different from any woman I had ever met. Tall, elegant, perfectly styled hair, always manicured nails, an expensive perfume that lingered even after she left. She spoke in a sophisticated way, using medical terms I barely understood. She had a cosmopolitan air about her. She talked about places she'd visited, cities I only knew from magazine photos. "You're lucky to have such an attentive husband," she told me during my first appointment when Daniel insisted on coming in with me. I smiled in agreement. I really did feel lucky. At first, Daniel didn't show much interest in accompanying me to appointments. He always had some commitment at the store, some delivery to receive, some important customer to attend to. I went alone, came back alone, and told him the news in the evening. Everything changed after the third appointment. Suddenly, Daniel began insisting on taking me to the office. He would cancel appointments, leave the store with the employees, saying nothing was more important than our baby's health. It moved me, made me feel loved and protected. "I want to follow every detail," he would say. And indeed, during the appointments, he asked so many questions that I sometimes felt embarrassed. He asked about medications, vitamins, the baby's development. "Doctor, Olivia answered everything patiently, explaining in great detail, always looking into his eyes. It was during the 6th appointment that I noticed something strange. While the doctor was measuring my belly, Daniel stood behind her. I saw in the room's mirror that he adjusted a strand of her hair that had fallen on her face. It was such an intimate, familiar gesture. I felt a tightness in my chest, but quickly dismissed the thought. It's just pregnancy insecurity, I thought. I'm imagining things. The appointments became more frequent than normal. Dr. Olivia said she liked to closely monitor her patients, especially first-time mothers. Daniel always agreed, saying nothing was too much when it came to my health and the baby's. In the 6th month of pregnancy, I began to notice small changes in Daniel. The different cologne, the night outings with excuses about emergencies at the store, the calls he took in another room speaking in hushed tones. In his drawers, I found receipts from expensive restaurants I had never visited. One afternoon, while arranging his shirts, I found a perfume note in a jacket pocket. An elegant handwriting said, "Last night was wonderful. I can't wait to see you again." It wasn't signed. But that perfume, I knew that perfume. It was the same one I smelled every time I entered Dr. Olivia's office. I confronted Daniel that same night. He denied everything, became furious with me. "It's the pregnancy hormones making you paranoid," he shouted. "How can you suspect me, right now when we're about to start a family?" He cried, swore eternal love, hugged me, apologizing for his rudeness. In the following days, he showered me with flowers and small gifts, saying he wanted to make up for the unfair suspicion. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I was 6 months pregnant, completely financially dependent on him, living in a town where his family had influence. What would I do if I was right? Where would I go? How would I raise my child alone? The appointments with Dr. Olivia continued, but now I observed more carefully. I noticed the lingering looks between them, the complicit smiles, the way he always found a reason to stay alone with her after appointments. "I just want to clarify some doubts about the birth," he would say. And I, with a heavy heart, pretended to believe it. In the 8th month, I tried to change doctors. I told Daniel I didn't feel comfortable with Dr. Olivia, that I wanted an older doctor with more experience in deliveries. He reacted disproportionately, turned red with anger, banged on the table, and said it would be irresponsible to change obstetricians so close to the delivery that Dr. Olivia was the best professional in the region. After an intense argument, I gave in, mainly because I was afraid of being alone during such an important moment in my life. The last weeks of pregnancy were filled with silent anguish. I counted the days until my child's birth, but also feared what I would discover after he was born. I had nightmares almost every night. I dreamed I was alone in the delivery room, screaming for help, and no one came. I went into labor 3 weeks early. It was a rainy Sunday night. The contractions started after dinner, first weak, then increasingly stronger and closer together. Daniel seemed strangely nervous. Not the typical nervousness of a first-time father, but a different anxiety, almost as if he was waiting for something. "I'll call Dr. Olivia," he said, and went to another room. He returned minutes later, saying she was already on her way to the hospital, that she would meet us there. I found it strange. How would a doctor be so quickly available on a Sunday night? When we arrived at the hospital, Dr. Olivia was already there, impeccably dressed and made up, as if she had prepared for an event, not an emergency delivery. "Coincidence," she explained with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was just visiting another patient." Labor was long and painful. 15 hours of contractions, of pain, of fear. During all this time, I noticed that Daniel and Dr. Olivia exchanged meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking. At one particularly painful moment, I begged the doctor not to leave my side, but she said she needed to check on something and left the room. Minutes later, I noticed that Daniel had also disappeared. "Where is my husband? Where is the doctor?" I asked the nurse who was monitoring my vital signs. "They'll be right back," she answered without looking me in the eyes. There was something in her tone, a mixture of pity and embarrassment that made my heart tighten even more. When they finally returned, about 20 minutes later, I noticed that Dr. Olivia's lipstick was smudged and Daniel's hair, always perfectly combed, was disheveled. Something inside me broke at that moment, but labor was so advanced that I didn't have the strength to confront them. I could only think about my baby, about bringing him safely into the world. My son was born after 2 more hours of effort. A beautiful, healthy boy, despite being premature. I remember his cry, strong and vigorous, echoing through the room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But shortly after the birth, I began to have complications. I lost a lot of blood. My blood pressure dropped drastically. The last thing I remember before being sedated was seeing Daniel whispering something in Dr. Olivia's ear as she held my son. When I woke up, many hours later, I was alone in the room. There was no sign of my baby or Daniel. I frantically pressed the button, calling for the nursing staff. An older nurse entered with an expression that mixed pity and discomfort. She carried my son in her arms and an envelope. "Your baby is fine," she said, placing the boy in my trembling arms. "But I have something to give you." "I'm sorry." With my heart beating erratically, I opened the envelope while holding my son. It was a letter from Daniel, written in his impeccable handwriting. "Andrea, when you read this, I'll already be far away. I can't continue living a lie. I've been in love with Dr. Olivia for months, since the first appointments. I tried to fight this feeling. I tried to be the husband and father you expected, but I couldn't. Olivia received a job offer at a prestigious clinic in Europe, and we decided this is our chance to be together. I'm leaving you the house where we lived and a check that should cover the next few months of expenses. One day you'll understand that this was for the best, Daniel." The world collapsed on me at that moment. While I was giving birth to our son, facing pain and fear, they were planning their escape. While I was fighting to bring a life into the world, they were plotting behind my back. The most painful betrayal wasn't the escape, but discovering that their affair had started during my prenatal appointments. Those appointments where I naively thought my husband was showing love and care for me and the baby. The nurse, seeing my despair, sat beside me on the bed. "I know it's no consolation, my dear, but you're not the first and, unfortunately, won't be the last. Men like your husband don't deserve our tears. Now you need to be strong for this little boy. He only has you in the world." Looking at my newborn son's face, I found the strength to continue. There in that hospital room, alone with a baby in my arms and a broken heart, I swore that I would overcome this pain, that my son would never feel the absence of the father who abandoned him before even knowing him, that I would be both mother and father, that I would work twice as hard, that I would face the whole world if necessary. Little did I know that this moment of despair was just the beginning of my story. A story of pain, yes, but also of resilience, strength, and eventually, a revenge that fate would bring about. I left the hospital 3 days later. A kind neighbor came to pick me up, since I had no close family in town. I carried my son in my arms and a small bag with the few clothes I had brought. That's it. No bouquet of flowers, no "it's a boy" balloons, no proud husband to take us home. Just me and my baby facing the world. The house where we had lived, which Daniel mentioned in the letter, was the smallest property in his family's name. A simple house at the back of his parents' property. When I arrived there, I discovered that the lock had been changed. My mother-in-law was waiting at the door with a hard expression. "Daniel instructed me to give this to you," she said, extending an envelope without even looking at her grandson in my arms. Inside was a check and the keys to a small rented apartment on the other side of town. "Your belongings have already been taken there. It's better this way for all of us." I didn't cry in front of her. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. I held my head high, adjusted my son in my arms, and left without saying a word. The apartment was tiny, 1 bedroom, a living room, kitchen, a bathroom. In the boxes piled in the corner, I found my clothes, some household utensils, and nothing more. None of the furniture we had bought together, none of the memories we had built. It was as if our marriage had never existed. The check Daniel left barely covered 3 months of rent and food. He clearly expected me to return to my parents' house, humiliated, head down. But I had already decided. I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't be the daughter who brought shame to the family. I wouldn't be the poor thing who needed her parents' rescue after being abandoned. I named my son Michael. I chose it alone, without consulting anyone. Michael, like the warrior archangel, because I knew we would need strength to survive. In the first months, I lived on the money Daniel left and small sewing jobs I did at home. I always had a knack for needle and thread. I learned from my grandmother since I was little. The news of my abandonment spread quickly through town. People looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity when I went out to shop or take the baby to the doctor. Some older ladies even crossed themselves when they saw me pass, as if my misfortune was contagious. The whispers would stop when I approached, but would resume as soon as I turned my back. There goes the girl whose husband left for the doctor. They say they fled to Europe on the day her son was born. Poor thing, so young and already with her life destroyed. At first, each comment was like a knife wound. I would return home and cry softly after Michael fell asleep. But gradually, I developed a shell. I learned to pretend I didn't hear, to smile politely when people addressed me, to keep my head high even when all I wanted was to hide. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I would get up before the sun, breastfeed Michael, put him back to sleep, and sew until he woke up. Then I would take care of him during the day and go back to sewing at night when he slept. I only slept 4 hours a night, but I never complained. Every coin I managed to save was a small victory. It started with small repairs, hems, broken zippers, loose buttons. The neighborhood ladies, even those who gossiped about me, discovered that I did quick, neat work for a fair price. Soon they began bringing me clothes for more complex alterations. When Michael was 6 months old, I received my first order for a complete dress. A lady needed something to wear to her daughter's wedding and hadn't found anything in her size in the town's stores. I stayed up 3 nights in a row to finish on time, with Michael sleeping in the makeshift crib next to the sewing machine. The dress turned out perfect. The lady cried when she tried it on. She said she had never felt so beautiful. She paid more than agreed, and more importantly, spread the word to all her friends that there was a talented seamstress in town. That's how my small business began to grow. I didn't have money to open a shop, so I transformed the tiny living room of the apartment into a studio. I pushed the sofa to a corner, put a table for cutting fabrics, and received clients right there, with Michael playing in an improvised playpen. It wasn't ideal, but it was what we could have at that moment. The clients multiplied. Local society ladies who once looked at me with disdain now sought me out to order dresses. They complimented my talent, my good taste, my dedication. Some even seemed to forget that I was the abandoned one, treating me only as the skilled seamstress who could fulfill their fashion desires. It wasn't easy. There were days when Michael got sick, and I had to sew with him in my lap, feverish and crying. There were nights when my fingers bled from working so much with the needle, but I couldn't stop because there were deadlines to meet. There were moments when I felt so tired that I thought I wouldn't be able to get up the next morning, but I always did. For Michael, for myself, for that silent promise I made in the hospital that we would survive and prosper, despite the abandonment, despite the humiliation, despite everything. When Michael turned 1, I was able to rent a small space downtown to set up my studio. It was a room at the back of a shopping plaza, without a storefront, but it was a start. I hired an older lady to take care of Michael while I worked. Mrs. Teresa, a widow who lived in the same building as me, and who became attached to my son as if he were her own grandson. "You're a warrior," she would tell me as she watched Michael sleep. Many would have given up, gone back to their parents' house, surrendered to depression. But not you. You're different. I didn't feel like a warrior. I just felt like a mother doing what needed to be done to secure a future for her child. There was no choice. It was swim or sink. And I would never sink. A year and a half after the abandonment, when my small business was finally starting to prosper, I received a postcard. My heart froze when I recognized Daniel's handwriting on the envelope. I thought about throwing it away unopened, but curiosity was stronger. It was a photo of a European city with its cobblestone streets and old buildings. On the back, a short message that seemed calculated to hurt me. "We've formed the family I always dreamed of," and a small photo, Daniel, Olivia, and a newborn baby in her arms. I stood paralyzed looking at that image. They looked happy, smiling, fulfilled. The kind of family I imagined we would have when I discovered I was pregnant. The kind of family he promised me and then cruelly tore away from me. I spent 3 days in an almost catatonic state. Mrs. Teresa took care of Michael while I locked myself in the room, alternating between crying and staring into space. That postcard was like reopening a wound that I thought was beginning to heal. It was reliving the abandonment, the betrayal, the humiliation. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed inside me. I woke up before the sun, as always, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked at the postcard one last time and then burned it on the stove, watching the flames consume those smiling faces, that happiness built on my pain. No more tears, I told myself, no more being a victim. That was the day I really began to heal, not on the outside, but inside. I realized I had spent too much time and energy thinking about Daniel, about Olivia, about what they did to me. It was time to think only about me and Michael, about our future, about our possibilities. I threw myself into work with renewed vigor. I bought fashion magazines from the city, studied new styles, perfected sewing techniques I hadn't fully mastered yet. My creations became bolder, more original. I went from being just the seamstress who did alterations and repairs to becoming a true designer, creating unique pieces that couldn't be found in the region's stores. The women in town, always eager for novelties and to stand out at social events, loved this transformation. My clientele grew, now including ladies from neighboring towns who came especially to order my dresses. I had to hire an assistant, then another. The small studio at the back of the plaza became too cramped. Michael grew strong and healthy, oblivious to his father's absence. For him, our small family, me, him, and Mrs. Teresa, who became a sort of surrogate grandmother, was all he knew, all he needed. I bent over backwards to be present at every important moment. His first tooth, his first steps, his first words. I worked tirelessly, but always reserved time to play with him, to read stories before bed, to simply be there. When he turned 3, I managed to rent a small shop with a storefront on Main Street. I painted the facade a vibrant blue. I had a beautiful sign made with the name Andrea's Atelier. On the day of the grand opening, I made a small blue dress for a doll that I placed in the window, along with a child's suit of the same fabric. Mother and son matching. That's how we saw ourselves, an inseparable duo, sufficient unto ourselves. The shop prospered beyond my expectations. What began as a desperate struggle for survival transformed into a respectable business. I was no longer the poor thing who had been abandoned, but the talented designer on Main Street. The same people who once whispered behind my back now greeted me with respect, praised my work, envied my success. But the world is small, especially in small towns. And fate has a peculiar sense of humor, sometimes cruel, sometimes just. When Michael was about to turn 4, I heard rumors that Daniel's family was facing financial difficulties. Apparently, he had contracted enormous debts abroad, using the family name and properties as collateral. I didn't pay much attention to these comments. I had learned to filter the town gossip, not to feed that endless cycle of hearsay. I was too busy with my expanding studio, with Michael's education, with our plans for the future, to worry about what was happening to those who had abandoned us. Until one rainy morning, the last person I expected to see walked into my studio, my former mother-in-law, Leonora, older, more haggard, without the air of superiority she always carried when we met during my brief marriage. Her clothes, always impeccable, seemed worn. Her jewelry, always ostentatious, was absent. I froze when I saw her standing at the door, looking around with an expression that mixed surprise and discomfort. Michael was at preschool, thankfully. I would never allow him to be exposed to any part of that painful past. "May I help you, ma'am?" I asked, in the most professional and distant voice I could manage. "Andrea," she said, and her voice trembled slightly. "We need to talk." At that moment, without my knowing it, fate was beginning to weave its own form of justice. A justice that I could never have planned or executed with my own hands, but that would arrive implacably, as it always does for those who sow pain and betrayal. I indicated a chair for her, more out of politeness than desire. My heart was racing. It had been almost 4 years since we had contact. 4 years since she handed me those keys and dismissed me like someone getting rid of an inconvenience. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, refusing to sit down. "Daniel and Olivia are back." Those 4 words had a strange effect on me. I didn't feel anger or sadness or fear. I felt only a slight tingling in my fingertips, as if my body was preparing for something that my mind hadn't yet fully comprehended. "And why should that interest me?" I asked, continuing to cut a silk fabric for the dress I was making. I didn't raise my eyes to her. I didn't want her to see any emotion on my face. Mrs. Leonora sighed deeply. Looking at her more carefully now, I noticed how aged she appeared. Her hair, previously dyed a vibrant brown, was gray at the roots. The wrinkles around her eyes and mouth had deepened. There was a fragility to her that I had never noticed before. "They failed completely in Europe," she said in a low voice. "The clinic they opened never prospered. Daniel couldn't adapt. He didn't speak the language, didn't know anyone. Olivia had difficulties validating her medical degree. In less than 2 years, they lost everything." I kept my expression neutral, although something inside me stirred. It wasn't satisfaction at their failure. It was something more complex, deeper, a feeling that the pieces of a cosmic puzzle were slowly falling into place. "That still doesn't explain why you came here," I finally responded, looking directly at her. Mrs. Leonora looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "They incurred enormous debts, used the family name as collateral, mortgaged properties that didn't even fully belong to them. My husband, he's ruined. The store we built over decades is on the verge of bankruptcy." I placed the scissors on the table and crossed my arms. "I'm sorry about your family's situation, Mrs. Leonora. I truly am. But I still don't understand what this has to do with me." "They're living with us now," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "In the back house, the same one. Well, the same one where you both lived. They brought their daughter, my granddaughter, a 3-year-old girl I barely know. Daniel is trying to save the family business, but no one trusts him anymore. No one wants to do business with a man who abandoned his wife on the day she gave birth." I finally understood the reason for the visit. "You've come to ask me to intercede for him? To tell people everything is okay, that I've forgiven him?" I gave a brief laugh, almost incredulous. "Is this serious?" "It's not just that," she said, finally sitting down, as if her legs could no longer support her. "Olivia, she can no longer practice medicine here. There was an anonymous complaint to the medical board about unethical behavior, something about abandoning a patient in labor. They're investigating. She's devastated, depressed. She's not the strong, independent woman who took my son away. An anonymous complaint. Interesting. It certainly wasn't from me. I had moved on, focused only on rebuilding my life. But in that small town, where everyone knew everything, there was no shortage of people who witnessed my suffering, who saw a woman in labor being abandoned by her husband and by the doctor who should have been caring for her. What exactly do you expect from me, Mrs. Leonora? I asked directly, tired of this roundabout. She took a deep breath before answering. You have influence now. People respect you. If you said that you don't hold a grudge, that you understand that they fell in love and made a mistake, maybe things would improve for us. It was at this moment that I truly saw the complete picture. Justice had arrived, not by my hands, but by the inexorable wheels of fate. Daniel and Olivia, who had fled believing they would find happiness built on my pain, were now back, defeated, humiliated, dependent on the charity of the family they had also harmed. And I, the woman they expected to wither in shame and poverty, I had prospered. My studio was a success. My son was growing happy and healthy. I had built a dignified, respectable life without needing anyone. I looked at Mrs. Leonora for a long moment. I didn't feel hatred or desire for revenge. I felt only a strange and tranquil certainty that everything was exactly as it should be. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Leonora," I finally said. "I can't do what you're asking, not out of resentment or desire for revenge, simply because it would be a lie. I don't understand what they did. I will never understand how a man can abandon his wife at the moment of childbirth, how a doctor can violate her oath to care for patients. I cannot tell people that everything is okay because it's not." Her shoulders fell, defeated. "I understand," she murmured. I felt a twinge of compassion for her. She was a mother trying to protect her son, even if that son didn't deserve protection. "What I can promise," I added, "is that I won't do anything to worsen their situation. I don't need to. Life is already doing that for me." When she rose to leave, something occurred to me. Mrs. Leonora, the little girl, their daughter, she's not to blame for her parents' mistakes. If at some point she needs anything, she can come to me. She looked at me surprised, perhaps expecting any reaction but this. She nodded briefly and left the studio without saying anything more. That night, after putting Michael to bed, I sat on the small balcony of the apartment we now could call home, a larger, comfortable apartment that we bought with the fruits of my labor. I looked at the stars and for the first time in a long time consciously thought about Daniel and Olivia. I imagined them returning, heads bowed, to the same town they had left triumphantly. I imagined them facing the accusing glances, the whispers, the silent, more implacable judgment of a community that never forgot what they did. I imagined them dependent on the charity of their family, when before they had the world at their feet. I felt no joy at their suffering. I felt only the confirmation of what my grandmother always said. "Life collects its debts, my daughter. Sometimes it takes time, but the bill always comes due." In the following weeks, inevitably, I began to see them around town. The first time was at the market. I was choosing fruit when I felt that peculiar sensation of being watched. I raised my eyes, and there he was on the other side of the stand, Daniel, looking much older than his years would justify. Our eyes met for an instant. I was the one who looked away first, not out of shame, but because he no longer meant anything to me. He was just a man I had known long ago, a stranger now. Later I saw Olivia in the main square. She was sitting on a bench, watching a little girl play in the sand. Her daughter, I presumed. Olivia had also aged prematurely. Her once impeccable hair was now dull, tied in a simple bun. The elegant clothes had been replaced by a plain, unremarkable dress. When she saw me pass, she quickly lowered her eyes, as if she couldn't bear to look at me. The entire town commented on their return, on their downfall, on the poetic justice of it all. I kept myself away from these conversations, neither feeding nor denying the rumors. I had more important matters to occupy myself with. My studio continued to prosper. I had hired 2 more seamstresses and an assistant to handle sales while I concentrated on creation. My dresses began to be known beyond the borders of our small town. I received invitations to present my work at fashion fairs in the capital. Michael began his studies at the best school I could provide. He was an intelligent, curious boy, full of life. His teachers always praised his education, his kindness, his willingness to help his classmates. "You're raising a man of character," they would tell me. And there was no compliment that made me happier. Approximately 6 months after Daniel and Olivia's return, I received an unexpected visit at the studio. It was almost closing time when the door chime rang. I looked up and saw Olivia standing at the entrance, hesitant, almost fearful. "May I come in?" she asked in a low voice, Nothing like the confidence she displayed when she was the respected doctor in town. I made a gesture indicating yes. My employees looked curiously at the unexpected visitor, but with a discreet nod, I asked them to leave us alone. Olivia approached slowly to the counter where I was. She seemed to have mentally rehearsed what she would say, but now that she was in front of me, the words seemed to fail her. "How can I help you?" I finally asked, maintaining a neutral, professional tone. She began, then stopped, took a deep breath, and started again. "I came to ask for forgiveness." It wasn't what I expected. A request to so address, perhaps, or even some kind of confrontation or accusation. But forgiveness? That caught me off guard. "Forgiveness?" I repeated slowly, testing how the words sounded. "For what? For having an affair with my husband while you were my doctor? For running away with him on the day I gave birth to his son? For trying to build your happiness on my misery?" My voice wasn't angry, just direct. They were real questions, not disguised accusations. Olivia didn't look away as I expected. She held my gaze even as her eyes filled with tears. "For all of that," she answered simply, "I have no justifications. There are no excuses for what we did. It was cruel. It was unethical. It was unforgivable." I crossed my arms, waiting for her to continue. "I thought I was in love," she went on. "Daniel seemed everything I always wanted. Charming, decisive, willing to leave everything for me. I convinced myself that what we felt was special, that it justified what we did to you. I told myself that you were young, that you would get over it, that you would find someone else." She paused, wiping away a tear. "But in Europe, away from here, without the emotion of the forbidden, without the adrenaline of the secret, I realized that we didn't really know each other. Daniel wasn't the man I thought he was. He began to drink, to spend money we didn't have, to go out with other women." A sad smile crossed my lips. Someone who abandons his own wife on the day of childbirth would be capable of abandoning anyone, I commented softly. Olivia nodded. "When I discovered I was pregnant, I thought things would improve, that he would dedicate himself to our family, as I thought he would dedicate himself to you and your son. But it wasn't like that. He was absent throughout the entire pregnancy. He almost didn't go to the hospital when our daughter was born. Afterward, he hardly ever held her." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Our relationship ended a long time ago, even before we came back. We're together only on paper, living under the same roof only out of financial convenience. Daniel is always out, probably with other women. I don't care anymore. I only care about my daughter." I could have felt satisfaction hearing that. I could have thought, "Serves you right." Or, "You reap what you sow." But I didn't feel any of that. I felt only a deep certainty that life follows its course, that choices have consequences, that no one escapes the final balance of their own actions. "Why are you telling me all this?" I finally asked. "Because I want you to know that I understand now. I understand the pain I caused, the harm we did." "And why is that?" "Because I saw you the other day with your son. He's so big now, so handsome, he looks so much like his father. He doesn't look like anyone but himself." I cut in suddenly, protectively. "Michael is his own being, his own person. He's not an extension of anyone." Olivia nodded quickly. Of course. I just meant, you two look well. You've built something here, something respectable, something of your own, while you've reaped exactly what you've sown," I completed. There was no cruelty in my words, just the observation of a fact, like a mathematical equation that finally finds its result, like the night that inevitably follows the day. Olivia bowed her head. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly that." When she raised her eyes again, there was a silent plea in them, a desperate need for absolution, for relief from the burden she carried. I don't know what made me say what I said next. Perhaps it was compassion. Perhaps it was the desire to finally close that chapter of my life. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that holding a grudge would only keep me tied to a past that I had already overcome. I can't say that I forgive you, Olivia. It wouldn't be sincere. What you and Daniel did changed the course of my life forever. But I can say that I no longer carry anger. I don't wish you ill. You have already reaped the consequences of your choices, just as I have reaped mine. I paused, reflecting. You know what's funny? If you hadn't done what you did, I would probably just be Daniel's wife, dependent on him, living in his shadow. I would never have discovered my own strength, my talent, my ability to survive and prosper on my own. In a way, you did me a favor. Olivia looked at me confused, unsure if I was being sincere or sarcastic. I wasn't sure myself. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what happened, I clarified. The pain was real, the abandonment was cruel, but the end result, the person I became, for that, maybe I can one day feel something like gratitude. Something passed through her eyes then. Understanding, perhaps, or perhaps just surprise at not finding the hatred she expected. Your daughter? I asked softly, changing the subject. What's her name? Claire, Olivia answered, seeming surprised at my interest. Claire, I repeated. It's a beautiful name. She's not to blame for your choices. If she ever needs anything at all, she can come to me. Olivia looked at me as if I were some kind of impossible to decipher enigma. Why? She finally asked. Why would you do this after everything? I smiled slightly. Because I can? Because I choose to be the kind of person who extends a hand, not one who turns their back. Because one day, perhaps, Claire and Michael will meet in this small town, and I don't want them to carry the weight of their parents' mistakes. When Olivia left the studio, I watched through the window as she walked down the street, shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. And at that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had won. Not because they had lost, but because I had refused to let their actions define who I would be. The true revenge was never about making Daniel and Olivia suffer. It was about my refusal to be destroyed by them. It was about transforming abandonment into independence, pain into strength, humiliation into dignity. It was about looking into the eyes of the woman who helped destroy my marriage and being able to say with sincerity, I'm fine, I'm more than fine, I'm whole. The following years brought changes I never imagined for my life. My studio continued to grow to the point where I needed to move to a space 3 times larger on the town's main street. Andrea's atelier was no longer just a name, it had become a brand known throughout the region. Ladies from neighboring towns traveled especially to order my dresses, and some families from the capital who had vacation homes in the region made a point of taking my creations back for their elegant parties. With the growth of the business, I was able to provide Michael with everything a child could desire, not just the essentials, good school, comfortable clothes, healthy food, but also small luxuries, a new bicycle, books, educational toys. I was never one to spoil him. I always made a point that he understand the value of work and effort, but I was proud to be able to say yes when he asked me for something reasonable, without having to calculate if we would have enough money for rent at the end of the month. Michael grew strong and intelligent. At 8 years old, he was already the best student in his class, with an insatiable curiosity about how things worked. He took apart toys to see what was inside, asked questions that often I didn't know how to answer. He spent hours in the small-town library devouring science books. Mom, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor, he told me one day while we were having dinner. The spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. Doctor, like the woman who helped his father abandon us. A cruel coincidence, a sign of fate, or just the natural vocation of a curious and compassionate boy? Why, my son? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Because I want to help people, and because I like to know how the body works. The teacher said, I have a knack for science. At that moment, I made an important decision. Daniel and Olivia had taken a lot from me, but I wouldn't allow them to also take away my son's dreams. If Michael wanted to be a doctor, I would do everything in my power to make that dream come true, no matter how much the idea initially bothered me. "It's a very beautiful profession," I finally answered. "If that's what you want, we'll work together to make it happen." Life in the small town followed its own rhythm. Over the years, Daniel and Olivia's return ceased to be news, transforming into just another case of old gossip that occasionally resurfaced in conversation circles. People moved on, as did I. I learned, through the inevitable information networks of the town, that their marriage had officially ended. Olivia had gotten a job as a nurse at a clinic in the neighboring town, making the bus journey daily. Daniel continued living with his parents, increasingly sunk in drink, unable to regain the business trust he once had. I rarely saw him, and when it happened in some street or establishment, we exchanged only distant nods of recognition, like remote acquaintances who once shared a table at some forgotten party. When Michael turned 10, I decided it was time for a bigger change. My business had grown to the point of attracting the attention of a fashion magazine from the capital, which published a small article about the talented designer from the small town who created pieces comparable to those from major fashion houses. After this publication, I received invitations to present my work at a fashion fair in the capital. "What do you think about moving to the big city?" I asked Michael one night as we looked at the stars from our balcony. "You could study in better schools with more resources, and I could expand the studio." He remained silent for a moment, thoughtful, as he always was. "Will we leave everything behind? My school, my friends, Mrs. Teresa?" "Some things, yes," I answered honestly. "But we'll take the most important things, ourselves, our memories, our dreams, and we can visit whenever we want. It's not goodbye, it's see you later." Michael nodded slowly. "I think it would be an adventure," he finally said, with that gleam in his eyes that always appeared when facing a new challenge. The move to the capital was both frightening and exciting. We found a comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood close to an excellent school for Michael. I rented a space for the studio in a promising commercial area, bringing with me my most talented seamstresses who accepted the adventure of starting over in the big city. The first months were about adaptation. The big city was noisy, hurried, sometimes too impersonal after years living where everyone knew each other by name. Michael missed his friends. I missed the familiarity of the streets I knew so well. But gradually, we built our new routine, made new friends, found our place. The studio prospered beyond my most optimistic expectations. The small article in the magazine had created a curiosity about my work, and soon we were serving a refined clientele, including businessmen's wives, artists, influential women who appreciated the handcrafted and unique touch of my creations. I hired more employees, expanded the product line to include accessories, and even received proposals to open a second store in another upscale neighborhood. Michael flourished in the new school. His teachers quickly recognized his intelligence and dedication, placing him in advanced science programs. He made friends easily, thanks to his gentle and good-humored nature, and his dream of becoming a doctor only strengthened, now fueled by visits to science museums and special lectures that his school provided. One afternoon, when Michael was 12, he came home from school with a peculiar expression, a mixture of confusion and curiosity that immediately alerted me that something important had happened. "Mom," he began hesitantly, sitting at the kitchen table while I prepared dinner. "Today I met a new girl at school. Her name is Claire." My heart skipped a beat. Claire, the name of Olivia and Daniel's daughter. It could be a coincidence, of course. Claire wasn't such an uncommon name, but something in Michael's expression told me that wasn't the case. "She said she came from the same small town as us," he continued, "and when I mentioned my last name, she got strange. Then she asked me if my dad's name was Daniel." I put the knife down on the cutting board and took a deep breath. This moment had always existed as a distant possibility on the horizon, but I never imagined it would come so soon, nor in this unexpected way. "What did you answer?" I asked softly. "I said yes, that was his name, but that I never really knew him, that it was always just you and me." He paused. "Then she said that Daniel was her father too, that it made us half-siblings." I sat across from him, taking his hands in mine. Over the years, I had answered Michael's questions about his father with age-appropriate versions of the truth. I never lied, but I also never burdened him with the most painful details. He knew that his father had left us when he was a baby, that he had formed another family, that he chose not to be part of our lives. "Yes, my son," I gently confirmed. "Claire is your father's daughter with another woman. Technically, that makes you half-siblings. Why did you never tell me about her?" "Because I never thought you would meet. Our town is small, but you never frequented the same places. And then we moved here. It was an extraordinary coincidence that you ended up at the same school." Michael was silent, processing the information. It was always like this. He needed time to digest news, to analyze all angles before forming an opinion. "She seems nice," he finally said. "A little sad, maybe. She said her parents are separated, that she lives only with her mother, that her father hardly ever sees her." I felt a twinge of compassion for Claire. Growing up with an absent father, even having him nearby, might be as difficult as growing up knowing your father chose to leave. Perhaps more so, the constant disappointment instead of the definitive absence. "How do you feel about this?" I asked. "About meeting your half-sister like this suddenly?" He shrugged, with that mixture of maturity and innocence that only children can manage. "It's strange, but it's also interesting. I've always wanted to have siblings." "And did you talk more after this revelation?" "Yes. We discovered we both like science. She wants to be a marine biologist, knows everything about dolphins." He smiled slightly. "We arranged to have lunch together tomorrow, if that's okay with you." I looked at my son, so understanding, so open, so free of the resentment he could easily have inherited from me if I had allowed bitterness to shape our life. At that moment, I felt a wave of pride so intense it almost made me cry. "Of course it's okay," I answered. "Claire isn't to blame for the choices adults made before she was even born, and having a sister can be a wonderful thing." In the days that followed, I was tense, waiting for Olivia to appear at the studio door or call me. Surely Claire had told her mother about meeting her half-brother, but the call never came. Perhaps Olivia was as hesitant as I was about how to handle this unexpected situation. Or perhaps, like me, she had decided that the best thing was to let the children build their own relationship, free from the complications and resentments of the past. Michael and Claire developed a cautious friendship that gradually strengthened. They had lunch together at school, exchanged books, sometimes studied together in the library. Michael invited her to his birthday party, and she attended, shy but visibly happy to be included. I met her briefly on that occasion. A sweet girl with expressive eyes that reminded me of Daniel's, but with a gentleness in her gaze that was all her own. A few months after this initial meeting, I received a letter at the studio. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. Olivia. I opened it with slightly trembling fingers, uncertain about what to expect. It was a brief, direct letter. She thanked me for allowing Michael and Claire to get to know each other, for not transferring to him resentments that would be understandable. She explained that she had moved to the capital to offer better educational opportunities to her daughter, exactly as I had done. She now worked in a public hospital, no longer as a doctor, but as a nurse, a humble restart after losing her medical license. She assured that she would respect any boundaries I wanted to establish regarding contact between the children. I read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. Finally, I picked up the phone and called the number she had included at the end of the letter. Our conversation was polite, cautious, but not hostile. Two mature women pragmatically discussing the well-being of their children. We agreed that Michael and Claire should be free to develop their half-sibling relationship without the shadow of the mistakes and resentments of the past. We agreed that we would keep our distance from each other, interacting only as minimally necessary to facilitate contact between the children. "And Daniel?" I finally asked, curious despite myself. "Does he know the children have met?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No," Olivia finally answered. "Daniel rarely sees Claire. He "He's not well, Andrea. The drinking, the business failures, he's just a shadow of the man we knew." I didn't feel satisfaction hearing this. Just a kind of distant sadness, like what we feel when reading about a tragedy in a newspaper. Real, but not personal. Daniel had left my life so long ago that his current condition affected me as much as that of a stranger. "I'm sorry," I said, and realized it was true. Not for what we lost, that was long overcome, but for the wasted life, for the father that Michael and Claire never really had. In the years that followed, Michael and Claire maintained their friendship and siblinghood, finding support in each other during the turbulent adolescent phase. Occasionally, Claire would come to our house to study or spend a weekend. She was a sweet and serious girl with a quiet determination that I recognized as similar to Michael's and perhaps my own. During one of these visits, when they were both 15, Claire brought news that shook our fragile peace. Daniel was sick, hospitalized with advanced liver cirrhosis. The doctors weren't giving much hope. Michael came to me that night after Claire had gone home with a question that I had secretly feared for years. "Mom, I think I should visit my father in the hospital. What do you think?" I looked at my son, now almost a man, with Daniel's features visible in his face, but with an inner strength that was all his own, all ours. I could easily have said no. I could have reminded him how that man abandoned us, how he never sought to know his son, how he didn't deserve the comfort of a visit on his deathbed. But what kind of person would that make me? What example would I be setting for my son? "If that's what you feel you should do, then yes," I answered. "Not for him, but for you, so you never regret not having tried." Michael nodded, his eyes shining with contained tears. "Would you come with me?" The question caught me off guard. Visiting Daniel after everything seemed unthinkable. And yet, wouldn't it be the final chapter of this long and complicated story? Wouldn't it be the ultimate proof that we had truly moved on, that the past no longer had power over us? "Yes," I finally answered. "I'll go with you." The next day, Michael and I went to the hospital. The journey was silent, each lost in our own thoughts. My son, normally so talkative about everything, now seemed concentrated, as if mentally rehearsing what he would say to the man he had never really known, but who carried in his blood and in some of his features. For me, it was an even stranger journey. I hadn't seen Daniel in person for more than 15 years. Just distant glimpses in the small town before we moved. The man I had once been in love with, whom I had married full of hope, who had abandoned me at the most vulnerable moment of my life. Now he was dying in a hospital bed. What emotions should I feel? Anger, satisfaction, pity? Perhaps just a quiet acceptance that life collects its price in ways we could never plan. The hospital was an impersonal, antiseptic place with that characteristic smell that always made me uneasy. At the reception, we informed who we were looking for and were directed to the 3rd floor, liver treatment ward. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked Michael as we waited for the elevator. "No one would judge you if you changed your mind." My son looked at me with those deep eyes that always seemed to see more than could be seen. "I'm sure, Mom. Not for him, but for me. I need to do this." In the 3rd floor corridor, we found Claire waiting. She looked pale, tired, as if she had spent the night awake. She hugged Michael at length, and then, to my surprise, she hugged me too. "Thank you for coming," she said in a low voice. "My mother is in there with him now. The doctors said it could be today or tomorrow." I nodded, not knowing what to respond. The reality of the situation was beginning to weigh. Daniel was really dying. Regardless of the history we had, a life was coming to an end. Claire led us to the room. I stopped at the door, hesitant, letting Michael enter first. I observed from the threshold as my son slowly approached the bed, where an unrecognizable man lay connected to tubes and monitors. Daniel was so changed that, had it not been for the context, I would never have recognized him. The once handsome and haughty face was swollen, yellowed by disease. The hair, once dark and shiny, was now thin and completely gray. His body, once strong and athletic, seemed to have withered under the hospital sheet. Olivia was sitting by the bed. She had also aged, but in a more dignified way. She had expression lines around her eyes and mouth, her hair now naturally gray, tied in a simple bun. She dressed with the practical simplicity of someone who worked in a hospital. Durable fabric pants, a comfortable blouse, low shoes. Our eyes met for an instant. There was no hostility in her eyes, just a kind of tired resignation. She nodded slightly, acknowledging my presence, and then turned to Michael. "Daniel," she said, gently touching the arm of the man in the bed. "Your son is here." Daniel opened his eyes slowly, as if the simple act required monumental effort. His gaze, once so lively and penetrating, was now clouded by disease and medication. He blinked a few times, trying to focus his vision on the young man standing at the foot of the bed. "Michael?" he asked in a hoarse, almost unrecognizable voice. My son stepped forward, uncertain. "Yes," he answered simply. A heavy silence hung in the room. What do you say to a father who was never a father? What do you say to a son who was never a son? What words could fill 15 years of absence? "You look like me," Daniel finally murmured, "when I was your age." Michael didn't respond immediately. He looked at the man in the bed with an expression that mixed curiosity and compassion. There was no anger on his face. Over the years, I had made sure he understood that Daniel's abandonment reflected the father's failings, not his own. "Claire showed me some old photos," Michael finally said. "I think I have your eyes." Daniel nodded weakly. A monitor beside the bed beeped, as if to remind everyone of the fragility of the moment. Olivia adjusted something on the IV and exchanged a worried look with Claire. It was at this moment that Daniel saw me standing at the door. His eyes widened slightly, and an emotion difficult to name passed over his face, ravaged by disease. "Andrea," he whispered. "You came?" I entered the room then, standing beside Michael, but keeping my distance from the bed. "Yes," I answered simply. "I came with our son." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather strength. When he opened them again, there were tears in them. "I'm sorry," he said in a choked voice, "for what I did to you both. There's no excuse." It wasn't the first time I'd heard an apology from someone who had hurt me. Olivia had done the same years ago, but there was something different now. Perhaps the imminence of death, which has the strange power to strip people of their masks and defenses, revealing raw truths that everyday life allows them to hide. "I didn't come here for accusations or forgiveness," I calmly responded. "I came because Michael wanted to meet you, because despite everything, you are his father." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting my words. He then turned his attention to Michael, as if wanting to absorb every detail of the son he never knew, to memorize his face, to take with him wherever he was going. How is your life?" he asked hesitantly. What do you like to do?" Michael moved closer to the bed, seeming more at ease. "I'm in my last year of high school," he answered. "I'm going to apply to medical school next year." A small smile appeared on Daniel's dry lips. "Doctor," he murmured. "What an irony." "It's not irony," I intervened softly. "It's choice. Michael chose this path for himself, for his own reasons." Daniel looked at me, and for an instant I saw a glimpse of the man he once was, perceptive, capable of seeing beyond the words said. "You did a good job," he said. "A job that I should have helped do." There was nothing to respond to that. It was simply the truth, a truth that had shaped our lives for the past 15 years. "Claire told me you have a fashion studio," Daniel continued, seeming to make an effort to maintain the conversation, "that you've become very successful." I nodded briefly. "Yes, I started sewing at home after Michael was born. It grew little by little. Now we have 2 stores in the capital." A gleam of genuine admiration passed through Daniel's tired eyes. "You were always strong, stronger than I ever was." The words caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting compliments, much less such an honest recognition of his own weakness. For a moment, I glimpsed what might have been. If Daniel had been a different man, if he had found in himself the strength to face responsibility instead of fleeing from it. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Michael telling about his studies, his plans for the future. Claire timidly joined in, mentioning how she and Michael got along well at school, how they studied together for science tests. It was an almost surreal scene. Two fractured families gathered at the deathbed of the man who had been the breaking point. Daniel was becoming visibly more tired, his breathing more labored. Olivia exchanged a significant look with me, indicating that perhaps it was time to end the visit. But before we could say goodbye, Daniel made a visible effort to straighten up a little in the bed. "Michael," he called, his voice now just a hoarse whisper. "I want you to know that the mistake was mine, not yours, not your mother's. It was my weakness, my selfishness." My son nodded solemnly, accepting the words. "I know," he answered simply. "And I want you to know," Daniel continued, each word seeming to cost him an immense effort, "that I regret it, not just now that I'm dying, but for years. I just didn't have the courage to say it." Michael looked at his father for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that surprised me with its maturity and compassion, he extended his hand and lightly touched Daniel's arm. "Thank you for saying it now," he said softly. When we left the hospital, the late afternoon sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in orange tones. Michael walked in silence beside me, lost in thought. I respected his space, knowing he needed to process the experience in his own way. Only when we reached the car did he finally speak. "Thank you, Mom, for coming with me, for everything." I looked at my son, so grown up, so decent, so different from the man we had just visited, and I felt a wave of pride so intense it almost took my breath away. "There's nothing to thank me for," I answered, holding his hand. "Everything I did for us." Daniel died 3 days later. Michael attended the funeral, accompanied by Claire. I didn't go, not out of resentment, but because I felt my presence would be an intrusion in a moment that belonged to his children, not to the woman he abandoned decades ago. Our story had been closed for a long time. Life followed its course. Michael entered medical school as planned. Claire chose marine biology and got a scholarship to a university on the coast. They kept in touch, building a sibling relationship that, ironically perhaps, was the only positive legacy left by Daniel. My studio continued to prosper. At 50, I gave myself the luxury of delegating more responsibilities, working fewer hours, enjoying more of the life I had built with so much effort. I traveled, visited places that before only existed in magazines and movies, tried new things, made friends, and to my surprise, found love again. A mature, tranquil love, without the youthful bursts of passion, but with the solidity that only life experience can bring. Richard was a widower, a university professor, a kind and intelligent man who made me laugh and who looked at me with genuine admiration. We married in a simple ceremony, with Michael walking me down the aisle. "You deserve to be happy, Mom," my son told me at the party after the ceremony. "You always did." The years passed. Michael graduated with honors and chose pediatrics as his specialty. "I want to help children have a healthy start in life," he explained. He married a residency colleague, a sweet and dedicated young woman who perfectly complemented him. Claire came to the wedding, bringing her fiancé, an oceanographer she had met during an expedition. And then, on a sunny morning, I received the news that would change my life once more. I was going to be a grandmother. Michael and Mariana were expecting their first child. When my grandson was born, a healthy and strong boy with curious eyes that seemed to want to absorb the whole world at once, I cried tears of pure joy. Holding that little bundle in my arms, I thought about the long and winding road that had brought me here. I thought about the frightened young woman I once was, alone in a hospital room with a baby in my arms and an abandonment letter in my hands. I thought about the sleepless nights, sewing to ensure our livelihood, about the daily battles to build a dignified life for my son. I thought about the humiliations, the difficulties, the small and great victories along the way. And I realized that if I could go back in time and change anything, I wouldn't change a thing. Because each pain, each obstacle, each challenge had shaped me, had made me the woman I was, strong, independent, fulfilled. Because without the abandonment, perhaps I would never have discovered my own strength. Without the necessity, perhaps I would never have developed my talent. Without the loneliness, perhaps I would never have built the deep and unshakable relationship I have with my son. When Michael placed his baby in my arms for the first time, he whispered, "He has your name as his middle name, Mom, so he'll always remember where he comes from, the strength that runs in his veins." I looked at the perfect little face of my grandson and knew with a quiet certainty that the cycle was complete, that the pain had been transformed into strength, the abandonment into independence, the betrayal into an expanded capacity to love. The boy who was once abandoned by his father now became the father who would never abandon his son. The woman who was once betrayed would now help raise a new generation grounded in values of loyalty, honesty, and courage. We are not defined by the blows life deals us, but by how we respond to them. We are not limited by others' choices, but liberated by our own. Today, at 78, I look back and see a life that was worth living. A life built on ruins, yes, but that rose stronger and more beautiful precisely because of it. Like a Japanese vase broken and mended with gold, where the cracks are not hidden but highlighted, celebrated as part of that object's unique history. When people ask me if I forgave Daniel, I answer honestly. Forgiveness came, but not as a great moment of epiphany, not as a magnanimous gesture on my part. It came naturally, gradually, as he became less and less important in my story, as pain transformed into learning, anger into understanding, resentment into acceptance. The true triumph wasn't surviving the abandonment. It was thriving despite it. It wasn't moving forward. It was building an entirely new path, a path I might never have found if I hadn't been forced to look for it. I married while pregnant to a man who, on the day of childbirth, ran away with the doctor. That's a fact, an immutable part of my history, but it's not my entire history. It's just the first chapter of a much longer and much richer narrative, a narrative of resilience, of reinvention, of redemption. If you're watching this video and you're going through your own moment of pain, abandonment, betrayal, I want you to know, this is not the end. It's just the beginning of a story that only you can write. A story where you are the heroine, not the victim. A story where the last word will always be yours. Life breaks all of us in one way or another, but some grow stronger precisely in the broken places. I grew stronger. You can too. This is my story, and I'm grateful for every chapter of it, even the painful ones, even the difficult ones, because without them, I wouldn't be who I am today. And I quite like who I've become. Before ending, I want to ask you, who are watching, if this story touched your heart in some way, please leave your like and subscribe to The Grandma's Diary. This helps a lot to spread these stories of overcoming that can inspire other people who are going through difficult times. Share it also with someone you think needs to hear this message of hope. And don't forget to comment from where you're watching. I love knowing that my words reach people from so many different places. Thank you for listening to me today.